So the second element you need to consider when you're looking at sectional tension after 1820 is the people. And a question I suppose you want to ask is what individuals influenced sectionalism? Because that will make it much easier, I think, to talk about specific points rather than it just being an amorphous discussion about politics. Actually try and pin it down to a few individuals. Now, as I said, after 1820, certainly after 1830, slavery as an issue disappears from the political arena, partly deliberately. In 1836, what's known as the Gag Act is passed, because basically Congress was becoming overwhelmed with anti-slavery petitions. And so rather than having to read through them, they simply tabled them and didn't discuss it. But outside of politics, slavery is becoming a real bone of contention. So in the 1830s particularly, you have an increase in abolitionist agitation. Now the thing you've got to bear in mind is that abolitionists in this period are regarded, frankly, as nutters. They are extremists, they are seen as radicals, they are seen as irrational. They want to emancipate slaves with goodness knows what kind of racial economic cost that will bring. So although later they are seen as being on the side of the angels, for many in the early period they are seen as a very dangerous force in American society. But nevertheless, after 1830, you do have a rise in abolitionist agitation. And the most famous man associated with this, of course, is William Lloyd Garrison, who was editor of a newspaper called The Liberator, which was first published in 1831 and advocated immediate emancipation. There were differences. Some people talked about gradual emancipation, which is what many northern states had done after the Constitution was agreed. They had emancipated perhaps the children of their slaves, but Garrison didn't want this. He wanted immediate emancipation for everyone. The same year the Liberator was published, 1831, though, also saw a very violent event take place in Virginia, and that was when a slave called Nat Turner, who was an educated slave, led a rebellion, and many, many whites were massacred. And this caused a huge issue, obviously, in the South. People were terrified. And Virginia discussed slavery for the very last time. They discussed whether or not they were going to end it. They decided they were not going to end it. But nevertheless, the spectre of Nat Turner, this violent slave, affected America from that point onwards. I mean, even after the Civil War, you find people recalling the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831. So Nat Turner and William Lloyd Garrison, between them, if you like, are very symbolic of what's happening in terms of slavery. But you've also got a Southern congressman called John C. Calhoun, and you will come across him in your reading. And John C. Calhoun increasingly believed, as the South is a sort of separate section, and he increasingly believed that slavery was not only viable but an essential economic bedrock for American society. And it's very difficult for us today to get our heads around this. But the fact is they really were thinking hard about it. It wasn't just racism that drove them to maintain slavery. For some Southerners, and the most notable was a man called George Fitzhugh, they were perfectly happy if whites were enslaved as well. They believed slavery was necessary for a society to grow. They believed there had to be what another Southern slaveholder described as the mudsill of society. They wanted a group of people who would do all the hard work and enable others to improve themselves, read books, go to church, do works of art, whatever. They really believed slavery was the answer. So Calhoun comes up with this idea in 1837 that slavery was not a necessary evil, which is what the Founding Fathers had believed, but was instead, in his phrase, a good, a positive good. So that was very influential. And then, of course, you have other people that you will have heard of, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. That's when it comes out as a book. It had been serialized a year before. And it wasn't just a book and a series of chapters in a magazine. There were stenographs of it. It was a stage play. There were songs. I mean, it was a real cultural phenomenon, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So you can't underestimate the impact of that, even if you don't read it, because it is rather a long book, I think, for the 21st century. Other individuals you might want to look up and think about as having an impact on what happens after 1820 would be people like Dred Scott, who was a slave who had spent most of his life in the Free States, And he sued for his freedom because he said, I've lived in these free states, I should be free. And it was a very famous case. It dragged on and on and on, eventually got to the Supreme Court in 1857. And the judge, who was a man called Roger B. Taney, made a very famous ruling where he said that a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. The implications of this are more serious than you might think, because by doing this, by saying this, and making this ruling, Taney has overthrown the Missouri Compromise. If you remember, the Missouri Compromise established that there should be this balance between free and slave states. But what Taney did was he said slaves were not men or women, they were property, and Americans could take property where they wanted. So if you could take your slaves wherever you wanted, the Missouri Compromise was meaningless. So that's the significance of the Dred Scott ruling, and that's why it's so very important to understanding this period after 1820. And then perhaps the final person that you want to think about would be John Brown, that I've mentioned in the context of the massacre at Pottawatomie Creek. Of course, in 1859, he leads this very famous raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to instigate a slave rebellion there. And it's out of all proportion, really, to the reality of what could be achieved, but Southerners took it very seriously. The man who would later lead the Confederate armies and the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee, actually was sent to capture Brown, and John Brown was hanged. And many people thought that was a terrible mistake on America's part. Foreign observers thought it was a terrible mistake. Victor Hugo described it as Washington slaying Spartacus. So those are the main people, I think, that would be most useful to look at when you're trying to understand the period after 1820. But you've also got the politicians themselves, people like Lincoln and Douglas. You certainly have to think about what their perspective was, how they presented the whole slavery issue, and perhaps structure some of your reading around what they wrote. So the final element you want to think about when it comes to the growth of sectionalism after 1820 is perspectives. The political situation, it's important to understand. People will liven it up for you. But there is a big question of the relative perspectives of North and South. How did they see each other in this period? And what you're really dealing with here is this growth of the idea of the South as a separate nation. Now, historians argue about this back and forth, whether or not the idea of the South was something that emerged when the Civil War began, something that emerged during the Civil War. Some historians like John McArdle push it back to 1830, so the beginnings of the rise of abolitionist agitation. They say Southerners started to see themselves as separate because they felt under attack. But there's this idea that the South is somehow different, and gradually it is becoming different. When the Founding Fathers met and established a new nation, slavery was national. But by the time you get to the 1840s, it is something that is mainly associated with the South. Slavery has grown in the South as it's diminished in the North, largely because Northerners have sold their slaves to the South. Of course, you have to bear that in mind. Northerners managed to wash their hands of the whole thing by selling their slaves, which is where the phrase being sold down the river comes from, because a slave's life often involved starting either in the North or in Virginia and gradually moving down to the big plantations of Mississippi and Alabama. So this idea of the South is distinct from the rest of the North, and therefore the rest of the nation, is something that really contributes to the growth of sectionalism in this period. And this is not something that either section does on its own. It's a almost mutually agreed decision to portray the South as something separate and different. It has a completely different climate, it has a completely different lifestyle. I mean, slavery in the South doesn't just influence how Southerners make their living. It's not just about, getting the crops in. It influences every aspect of Southern life, every aspect of Southern culture. Historians usually argue that it makes white people feel secure because slavery offers a platform beneath which no white person can fall. But of course it is more complicated than that. But nevertheless, it does infect and affect the South, considerably. So Northerners increasingly see the South as something different, not always in a bad way. I mean, some Northerners see in the South a traditional kind of way of life that they feel they've lost in the North. In the North, particularly again after 1830, you have the rise of immigration. You have many, many people coming to the northern seaports, many coming from Ireland after the potato famines. You have the growth of ghettos in those seaports, places like Boston and New York and Philadelphia. Northerners look at all this change. They look at the abolitionists, they look at the reform movements. They think the world has gone to hell in a handcart. And they look to the South for something more stable, a more virtuous way of life. There is this myth, which still has some resonance today, that somehow North and South are different ethnically, that Southerners are descended from English cavaliers and that Northerners were descended from Roundheads. I mean, this of course isn't really true, but the myth did have some resonance. For some people it was a very positive thing. They saw the South as a land of splendour, wonderful plantation houses. You know, they read about this in their magazines. I mean, even Uncle Tom's Cabin portrays a sort of twisted version of this, a sort of dark heart of the South, but nevertheless it was the idea that the South was different. And I suppose in the Republican Party that I've talked about, what you have is the rise and the political expression of what I've called Northern nationalism. This idea that the North knew what was best for America, the Northern way of life was the better way of life for the United States. And this really comes out very forcibly in what were known as Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. Lincoln is standing for the Senate, and he's standing against a man called Stephen A. Douglas, who's a Democrat, and who came up with the idea, of course, of popular sovereignty in the territories. And this is where the whole question of America's future is discussed, and Lincoln makes his very famous statement about a house divided against itself cannot stand. He says it has existed half slave and half free, but he doesn't think it's going to continue existing that way for very much longer. And Lincoln believes that slavery is not just morally wrong, although some historians have questioned that, but he does see it as an embarrassment. This is the modern world, because you've got to remember from their perspective, it is the modern world. This is, you know, a new country, a new nation, a new republic, a new way of running a country, and Lincoln sees slavery as really holding it back. So Northerners come up with their idea of the future of America, and Southerners have their idea. So when the Civil War actually breaks out, you find bizarrely that both sides are claiming to adhere to the tenets of the Founding Fathers. They both think they have right on their side, but they're no longer seeing each other clearly. They're seeing these images of each other. They're seeing a South that's basically not exactly fantasy, but has elements of myth. And Southerners see Northerners as much more aggressive and determined to wipe out their way of life than they really are. So ultimately it comes down to this whole question of America's manifest destiny, which is a very important phrase, and I think one that you might find useful to apply to this period after 1820. It's not a phrase that comes into existence until the 1840s, in fact, but it's about America's right as a nation to expand across the continent, but it's also about what kind of nation America hopes to be. And so the rise of sectionalism after 1820 really revolves around that question. You know, how far can America expand, and what kind of nation is going to expand across the continent? Is it going to be a nation of free men, or is it going to be a nation predicated on slavery?